In Module 4, you will explore the principles of cryptography and then dive deeper into cryptography and encryption. You will learn how authentication and integrity play a key role in cryptography. Finally, you will acquire a knowledge of key distribution and certification, hashing, PKI, and certificate authorities. Encryption concepts like in transit and at rest will be explored. Why is it so important to understand cryptography and encryption concepts? Let's find out. In this video, you will learn to define cryptography and encryption, describe the related Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, Top 10 Project, and SANS Institute Top 25 Cryptography Weaknesses.
Hi everyone, my name is Dmitry Beryoza. I'm a member of IBM X-Force Ethical Hacking Team. Penetration testing is a type of testing where you pretend to be an attacker, an adversary, a hacker, and we try to break into the product. And as part of our work, after we do the testing and we find security vulnerabilities in software, we pass them on to development teams and they use them to improve product quality and secure the products. So today we'll talk about cryptography. Encryption and related cryptographic mechanisms such as hashing or digital signing, they're used to safeguard customer data and its integrity and also prevent unauthorized access to it. Today we'll be talking about common mistakes that we see in applying cryptography in our products, and we will not be talking about cryptography theory or algorithm implementation details. Those are huge topics. They're subjects of whole university courses and some really thick books. There's also something called Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it if you're building applications that are web-facing, which is probably something that most of us do these days. It's a very useful non-profit organization. They publish a lot of recommendations for securing your products, and they also publish something called Top 10 Common Vulnerability List. And as you can see, in the years prior, sensitive data exposure that's related to data not being secured with encryption has not only been featured on the top 10 list, but also has grown in prominence in the past few years. So it's becoming more and more important and more common. Also, there's something called SANS Top 25 list. I also strongly recommend that you familiarize yourself with it because it lists top 25 most dangerous software errors. And as you can see, there are at least 4 different types of errors that are related to cryptography that are featured on that list. And also to show that this is not a theoretical discussion, this is just a small sample of cryptography-related errors and vulnerabilities that were recently in the news. And it really took me just a couple of minutes to come up with these links. If you do a search, I'm sure you'll come up with more. So in this particular case, in Twitter software, there was a mistake made and passwords that should have been encrypted were actually exposed in plain text. And another company, Kaplan Health Systems, they lost control of their private business data and personal data of 43,000 patients when a laptop was stolen. That means that that data was not encrypted on the hard disk. So, as you can see, these are very common types of issues, and they're actively being exploited every day in attacks out there.
In this video, you will learn to describe encryption and common types of encryption algorithms, define cryptographic terms including hash function and digital signatures.
So to start, let's just do a small refresher on the basics. So encryption, of course, is a process of encoding data in such a way that unauthorized parties could not access it. And it's important to say that encryption only provides confidentiality guarantee. Somebody could still modify the data, the encrypted data, and if it's just encryption algorithms that you're using, you may not notice that the modification was made. And actually, later on, I'll talk about a specific type of attack that's related to that. It is possible to modify encrypted data without decrypting it and still be able to abuse the application. So it's also important to apply integrity mechanisms to the encrypted data that you're using. Data can be encrypted in three general scenarios. At rest, which is anything stored in files, databases, backups on mobile devices. Data can be encrypted in use. So when your application is running, you're loading data encrypted. Probably it's a good idea that it stays encrypted right until the moment that it's used. So encrypted in use means that data is in computer memory. And also encryption in transit. So when data is being sent over the network. And in this day and age, sensitive business and personal data should be encrypted at all times, everywhere. We're at that point where that's absolutely necessary. And the importance of this has risen dramatically in previous years because of, first of all, enormous volumes of sensitive information being collected and stored and accessible online. The dramatic increase in the number of breaches. If you just open the news, I'm sure every week you would see something related to a computer security breach and exposure of sensitive information. And also, governments all over the world are reacting, and they're introducing new legislation to deal with these types of attacks, and they will actually hold businesses liable if they're not encrypting sensitive data. So new legislation is another factor. There are different types of cryptographic algorithms. The biggest two are symmetric key encryption and public key encryption. And as you can see from these diagrams, symmetric key encryption uses a private key. Data is encrypted using it, becomes scrambled, and then when it's time to decrypt the data, the same key is used to reverse the process to get the plain text back. It's fast. The algorithms we use today for symmetric key encryption are pretty fast, but there's a difficulty associated with sharing of that key, because very often you don't only need to encrypt the data, but you also need to send that encrypted data somewhere, and you need to send the data safely and also the key safely. So that's a big problem that public key cryptography attempts to solve. There are a number of algorithms that you probably heard about: RSA, elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman. And in public key cryptography, there are actually a pair of mathematically linked keys that are created, a public key and a private key. And the way this works is, let's say I want to send an encrypted message to my colleague. My colleague creates two keys. One of them is private, and he keeps that very secure. But the other one is public, which is he shares with the world. And the way this works is I can take his public key, encrypt my message that I'm sending to him, and he will only be able to decrypt that message with his private key that he keeps secret. And that enables all kinds of people to send him messages and not be able to see messages that the other person sends, because the only person that can decrypt those messages has to be in possession of that private key. So it solves the problem of sharing the key, but these algorithms are generally slower than symmetric key encryption algorithms. Another important concept that we'll talk about is hash functions. They map data of arbitrary size to data of fixed size, and they work as a checksum of sorts. So they provide integrity guarantee, but not the confidentiality. So they have to be used together with encryption algorithms. So you probably have seen these algorithms before, use them in your work, MD5, SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3. The original data in these scenarios is deliberately hard to reconstruct. So let's say you take a file, you create a hash of that file, and then if that file is modified, let's say maliciously, and you take another hash of that file, the hash of the modified file will be very different from the original hash. So that way we can have a small checksum that verifies integrity of a huge data block. Hash functions are used for integrity checking, and they're also sometimes used for sensitive data storage, such as passwords, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Another important concept is digital signatures. It's a mathematical scheme for verifying authenticity of digital messages and documents, and actually uses two of the concepts we've mentioned so far, hashing and public key encryption. And the way it's done is, let's say, a message that's sent from one party to another. It is hashed, and the hash is signed with a private key. And the receiving party can, when the, let's say, the message or the file is received, can verify the hash and also use the public key to verify that the hash was not altered. So it actually ensures three different things. Ensures authentication. You can be sure that the party that sent the message is really the party that is claimed to have sent the message, because only that party should be in possession of the private key. It ensures non-repudiation. That means that that party cannot deny that they ever sent the message, because it was signed with a private key that's only in possession of that party or person. And also ensures integrity, making sure that the message or the file was not modified in transit.
In this video, you will learn to describe common pitfalls of cryptography.
So let's talk about some common problems associated with the use of cryptography in the products that we see. So the first very obvious one is missing encryption of data and communications. Products handle all kinds of sensitive business and personal data, and very often data is one of the most valuable asset that a business has. So when you store it or transmit it in clear text, it can be easily leaked or stolen. So that's a huge danger. And in this day and age, there is no excuse for not encrypting data that's stored or transmitted. There was less focus on it, let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but these days it's absolutely vital that this is done. And we also have the very mature cryptographic technology. It's well tested, and it's available for all environments and programming languages. So it's really, you don't have the excuse not to use it in your products. So our recommendation is to encrypt all sensitive data you're handling, and also ensure its integrity, because as I mentioned, encryption provides confidentiality, but not necessarily the integrity. Product owners that we talk to choose not to encrypt certain data because they say that users of their products don't have access to the file system the product is running on. Unfortunately, that's not a good excuse, because there are plenty of vulnerabilities out there that may allow exposure of files stored on the file systems, such as config files, databases, key stores. And these vulnerabilities are, for example, path traversal, local file inclusion, XML external entity attacks. So the attacker, what they could do is they could have what we call a kill chain. They could have a set of vulnerabilities that would abuse when they're attacking a particular business. And let's say path traversal could be one of them. They could steal a database that contains sensitive customer data and then rely on the fact that weak cryptography was used or no cryptography was used, and decrypt the data and use it. So, and actually another danger is that physical machine that the product is running on could be stolen. Hard disk could be accessed directly. So if the data is not encrypted, it will be leaked and abused. So the general rule of thumb is that you have to assume that the files containing sensitive information may be stolen, may be exposed and analyzed by the attacker. It's just something you have to go on. That has to be a basic assumption. Another problem that we sometimes see is implementing your own cryptography. Often developers use obfuscation and not cryptography. So you may be familiar with something called base64 encoding or XOR encoding and similar obfuscation schemes. Unfortunately, they do nothing for keeping the data secure. They're very trivially analyzed and reversed. So it's not to say that you shouldn't use those schemes, but never think that because, let's say, you base 64 encoded something, that makes it secure. It won't. And sometimes we even see products implement their own cryptographic algorithms. And it's just very dangerous practice that you definitely shouldn't do. Such algorithms never stand a chance against a serious attacker. And interestingly, there's something called Schneier's law, and Bill Schneier is a renowned cryptographer and coincidentally an IBM Resilient CTO. And what he wrote was, anyone from the most clueless amateur to the best cryptographer can create an algorithm that he himself can't break. It's not even hard. What is hard is creating an algorithm that no one else can break, even after years of analysis. So it's very possible that the algorithm you yourself come up with, you cannot figure out how to break it, and your colleagues couldn't either. But if you're, let's say, if your product you're developing that you're putting that algorithm in is securing data that some, let's say, nation state is after, those guys have very qualified people, brilliant mathematicians and cryptographers, and they'll probably easily be able to break the algorithm that you came up with. So please don't do that. Do rely on proven cryptography, the one that was scrutinized by thousands of professionals, mathematicians and cryptographers. And there's a National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, and it provides guidance on what algorithms are currently considered as secure. So check it out. It's something, it's a good idea to use it in your work, those recommendations. Another thing that we see is some products rely on their algorithms being secret. They just say, well, we have compiled application, it's all machine code, the attacker will never know our internal algorithms. Well, if you think that, well, I have bad news for you, they can and they will be discovered. It's only a question of how motivated the attacker is. There is actually a whole branch of hacking called reverse engineering, and it's devoted to discovering hidden algorithms and data. So there actually are contests out there ongoing where hackers compete on who can reverse a particular application the fastest. So people do this for fun, if you can imagine. And just imagine if there is some financial incentive there to discover your secret algorithm. So again, it doesn't stand a chance. Even if your application is only shipped in compiled form, it can be quote-unquote decompiled. Languages such as Java and Scala and others that go against Java virtual machine, languages such as C# that are compiled for .NET virtual machine, Python and other languages, they're trivially decompiled. You can basically recreate the original source code from the compiled representation. So if you give me a jar file, for example, if you're a Java developer, I can most likely decompile it for you and give you back your original source code. It's that bad. And even for languages that are harder to decompile, such as C and C++, because there are all kinds of optimizations done on the machine code, still special tools exist that sort of recreate a C code that resembles your original source code. So it's all easily reversible. Attackers also, like if you rely on your product being expensive and attacker not getting hold of it, it's possible that they would get a trial version that they will analyze, or just get a stolen copy somewhere in the dark web. And also, unfortunately, the reality is that sometimes there are rogue employees that may reveal company secrets. There was research done recently that found that more than a third of employees, when asked if they were willing to sell private company data, proprietary information, agreed to do so. And some of them agreed to do it for as little as $155. So you can imagine, you could have a very secret algorithm that's only kept on company premises, not shared outside the company, but it really only takes, some, rogue employee, so to speak, that's financially motivated to steal it and sell it to the bad guys out there. So relying on algorithms being secret is not a good mechanism. It's something called security by obscurity, and it's not no security at all. And actually, the contrary is being proven all the time. All algorithms that keep us safe today are open source and very well studied. So AES, RSA, SHA, and all others, like all our banking, communications, everything we use technologically today relies on open source algorithms that are very well known. And actually that's their strength, because so many people have looked at them and scrutinized them, so that all the bugs have already, or most of the bugs have already been worked out. So bottom line, do not rely on your algorithms being secret. Assume that they will be known to the adversary. And there is also a great guiding rule here called Kerckhoffs's principle. August Kerckhoff was a Dutch cryptographer in the 19th century. And what he said was, a crypto system should be secure even if everything about it except the key is public knowledge. I think it's a great principle to use in your work. Another pitfall that we see is using of hard-coded, predictable, or weak keys. Not safeguarding your keys can pretty much render your cryptographic mechanisms useless. It's basically the keys to the kingdom. So if you don't control them, if you expose them, then somebody can just use them and use the algorithm that you use to encrypt the data to decrypt it. When the passwords and keys are hard-coded in the product, and unfortunately we do see that from time to time, or they're stored in plain text in the config file, they're easily discoverable. If you have an encryption key that maybe is not encoded in plain text somewhere, but it's easy to guess, attacker could discover it by just trying commonly known passwords. There's something called ROCU lists out there, and there are many other similar lists, and it currently contains 14 million different common passwords. So let's say if you are using your email account and you have some password that's not truly random, there are high chances that it is actually on this list already. So attacker could just try all the passwords on this list one by one, and then be able, let's say, to get into your email account or decrypt some data that you encrypted with a common password. Also, when the keys are generated randomly, they have to be generated carefully from a cryptographically secure source of randomness. Let's say if you're a Java programmer, but the situation is similar in other programming languages, there is something called Java util random, and it's a random pseudo random number generator that, unfortunately, the numbers that it generates are very predictable. So if you generated your encryption key using that source, they can discover your key just through brute forcing. So instead, if you're generating encryption keys, you should use something called java.security.secure_random in case of Java, and there are similar variants for other languages. It's a cryptographically secure source of randomness, and it should be used when generating encryption keys. So the recommendation is to rely on hard-to-guess, randomly generated keys and passwords that are stored securely. Another problem that we sometimes see is that encryption is export-controlled. So any code that either contains encryption algorithms, calls encryption algorithms from other libraries or components, or directs encryption functionality in other products, all of them must be classified for export before being released.
In this video, you will learn to describe the digital state of data, data at rest.
So let's go through different types of encryption. So as I mentioned, rule of thumb is to encrypt all sensitive data at rest, files, config files, databases, backups, anything of value. And semantic key encryption is the most commonly used for that. You can follow NIST guidelines, that's the National Standards Institute, guidelines for selecting appropriate algorithm. Currently it's AES with the CBC mode and triple DES. Those are the ones that were approved. Unfortunately, there's a number of ways of doing it incorrectly. First of all, some algorithms are outdated and no longer considered secure. You have to phase them out. For example, DES, RC4, and there are some others. So you have to be very careful. As time goes on, some encryption algorithms become insecure because vulnerabilities are discovered in them, or computing power becomes such that it's now possible, or now within, you can probably break an algorithm within a reasonable time, given sufficient computing power. So watch out for that and migrate to more secure, modern algorithms. As I mentioned, using hard-coded, easily guessed, insufficiently random keys is a huge problem, because your encryption is as secure as the key that you chose and how well you safeguard it. So you have to select cryptographically random keys, and also do not reuse keys for different installs. Because let's say you have two customers, let's say you somehow embed the same encryption key in both of them. One of the customers has a rogue employee that steals that key, sells it on the dark web, and then an attacker could attack the second customer because they now know the common cryptographic key that's used in the product. So don't do that. Another problem is storing keys in clear text in proximity to the data they protect. Something like could be likened to key under the doormat. Keys, the only proper way of doing it is storing them in cryptographically secure key stores. Also, some cryptographic algorithms require something called initialization vectors, and those have to be chosen at random every time you apply the algorithm. If you reuse the initialization vector, that's another weakness that could be exploited. And it's preferable to select the biggest key size you can handle.
In this video, you will learn to describe the digital state of data in use.
Encrypting data in use, unfortunately, is not very often followed. Usually, product loads data from disk, decrypts it, and then just works with it. Unfortunately, it's very dangerous because some classes of vulnerabilities could expose portions of memory of the product. There's a very famous vulnerability called Heartbleed from a couple of years ago, and actually leaked memory of the processes that were using OpenSSL protocol and leaked them over the internet. So had those products been keeping the data encrypted in memory, then this wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been as dangerous. So the idea is to keep data encrypted even when you load it from disk, then decrypt it for a brief period of time when you actually need it, and then erase it. And that way, there's less opportunity for it to be leaked. And another thing to consider, it may or may not apply to your product, but there's something called homomorphic encryption. And it's a class of algorithms which allow you to operate on data without decrypting it. There's a lot of very complex math involved, but some uses allow for that. So you could at all times keep the data secure and at the same time do some analysis on it. And it's just something to keep in mind. Maybe your product would make use of it.
In this video, you will learn to describe the digital state of data in transit.
So encrypting data in transit is something we're all familiar with. In this day and age, there is absolutely no excuse for communicating in clear text. Just don't do it. There is an industry consensus about it. Recently, Firefox and Chrome started to mark HTTP sites as insecure. So, the sites that use encryption for communications, the proper prefix for that is HTTPS. So the sites that communicate in clear text, somebody can very easily snoop on those conversations and discover sensitive information. So all communications should be encrypted. It's not just HTTP that goes in clear text. Sometimes remote procedure calls, database connections, and others go over the wire in clear text, and that's just not recommended at all. Please avoid that. Make sure you encrypt all your communications. TLS SSL algorithms is the most commonly used protocol. They use a variety of crypto primitives internally, public key cryptography for authentication and key exchange, symmetric key cryptography for actual data encryption, and a server presents to the client something called digital certificate that references the public key that's to be used in the communications and the certificate authority. And we'll talk more about it a little later. Sometimes some products choose to only use symmetric key encryption, and that's fine if it's done securely. The big problem with that is how do you securely share the keys between the different nodes. So let's say you have different nodes, two different nodes in your application that are communicating. How do you securely share the private key so that it's not revealed in transmission? So what are some of the pitfalls? We see self-signed certificates being used quite often. It's basically a certificate that you generate yourself. It's less problematic for internal communications. It's a much bigger problem if your product communicates over the internet. And the proper way of doing it is actually to use certificates that are verified by established certificate authority. That way you can actually be sure that this is a certificate that comes from the party that claims to have created it. Some products, unfortunately, accept arbitrary certificates without validation. If you look at this code snippet, you may recognize it if you're a Java developer. Unfortunately, we see these from time to time in the code. Attackers basically can issue their own certificates, sit in the middle of communication between the client and the server. It's something called man-in-the-middle attack. And if your code contains this pattern, you're basically accepting any certificate that comes down the wire. So attacker can give you their own. They can talk to the server on your behalf, and they will just basically be listening on all your communications and capture all the private data. So do not accept certificates without validation. Unfortunately, validation is not enough because in these days, attackers could actually create valid certificates. They could use some certificate authority and get a valid certificate from it, and it will be validated correctly when you go to validate it. The way to deal with that is to use something called certificate pinning, and in that mechanism, the certificate that's presented is actually checked against a set of certificates that you expect to see. So you wouldn't just accept any arbitrary valid certificate out there, but only the one that, let's say, your node, one of your nodes expects from another node in your product. And that, in that case, man-in-the-middle attacks are much harder to do. What are some other problems? Sometimes products use outdated versions of the protocol or insecure cipher suites. Old versions of SSL and TLS are vulnerable. You can look up, there are all kinds of very famous attacks against them: Drown, Poodle, Beast, Crime, Breach, and there are others. They all have fancy names. But basically, over time, older versions of SSL and TLS were found to be insecure. They had problems with them. Those problems were subsequently rectified, and today we recommend TLS version 1.1 and up. So actually 1.1 is still considered secure, 1.2 is the recommended one. If you use anything below that, you may be in danger. So review the versions of TLS you support, and there are a number of tools that can help you, automated tools. There's Nessus, there's Qualys SSL server test. Unfortunately, it only works on publicly exposed sites. There's SSL scan and SSLIs on Linux. So use that and see if you're secure. Another problem is allowing downgrade of strength to insecure versions or even to HTTP. So to deal with that, you have to lock down the versions of TLS that you support and don't support any others. Do not allow downgrade. And as I mentioned before, using HTTP is just not a good idea anymore. Of course, you have to safeguard your private keys. If you lose control of that, attackers can decrypt your communications. There's some other recommendations. Consider implementing something called forward secrecy. Some cipher suites protect past sessions against future compromises of secret keys and passwords, so look into that. There have been a number of problems with using compression under TLS, so if you use HTTP compression and then it goes over secure channel, sometimes attackers can actually figure out your data because it's compressed. So there's actually a crime and breach set of attacks that dealt with that. So it's something to be aware of, and the recommendation is if you encrypt something, so do not compress statically served pages, but try not to compress pages that change on the fly. Another recommendation is implement HTTP strict transport security header on all of your communications, and also stay informed of latest security news, because from time to time vulnerability is discovered in a certain protocol, and you have to react to that in a timely fashion.
In this video, you will learn to describe hashing and its purpose in encryption, describe common pitfalls of using hashing, describe additional considerations when using hashing, define message authentication codes, MACs.
Let's talk about hashing. Hashing is used for a variety of uses. They're used to validate passwords, and we use salted hashes for that. I'll talk about that in a moment. They're used for verifying data and code integrity, and they're used in message authenticated codes and key hashes, and verifying data code integrity and authenticity in digital certificates. The recommended hash functions these days are SHA-2 suite and SHA-3, and there are a number of problems with using hashing incorrectly. First of all, there are a number of old, obsolete hash functions. They're now considered broken. Please phase them out. The hash function usually considered insecure when it's practical to generate collisions for it. So collision is two or more different inputs that correspond to the same hash value. And if it's fairly easy to come up with that, then your hash function is no longer secure. There are two very common hash functions that should be phased out. MD5 has been broken for more than 10 years. Collisions are fairly easily generated. SHA-1 was recently proven to be unreliable. It's not recommended for use anymore. And you can actually go to the website called shatter.io to see a demonstration of that. There are two different files shared there that have the same SHA-1 hash. Using predictable plain text that you're hashing is problematic. It's not quite a cryptography problem, but if, let's say, you hash a password and that password is easily guessed because somebody uses a list of commonly used passwords and that password just happens to be there. So when they use brute forcing, they could go through all possible combinations and come up with a hash that corresponds to this password. The fix for that is using something called salted hashes. Another actually problem with here, aside from this list, is the rainbow tables. They're a variation of lists used for brute forcing, and they're basically just gigantic tables that somebody else pre-computed of all possible combination of characters and the hashes corresponding to that. Well, of course, it's impossible to do it for, well, no, maybe not impossible, it's very hard to do it for the entire problem space, but for reasonably large inputs, it's possible to generate rainbow tables, and there's one that you can actually visit called Hash Killer. You can input some common name or a small number in there, and it'll probably give you the hash for that. And I assume that nation states are able to generate just gigantic rainbow tables and defeat hashing that way. And the way to prevent that is to use a salt. And a salt is a random byte sequence. We recommend at least 8 bytes that you add to the plain text before you calculate the hash. And you also share that salt in public. And as a result, the hash will be wildly different for the same password but different salt used. So you can see an example here. 2 users, they have their passwords encoded, hashed, but hashed with salt. And the password is the same for both users. But because the salt is used, you see in blue the hash value is completely different. And if hash is used, then rainbow tables become practical. There are some additional considerations when using hashing. Use key stretching functions together with hashing with a large number of iterations, and they're deliberately slow, and that's controlled by the number of iterations, and they make brute forcing attacks impractical, both online and offline. And you have to aim for maybe 750 milliseconds to complete the operation. So it slows down the calculation of the hash, And if you're trying to brute force a large list of passwords, it just becomes impractical. It takes too long. So here there's an example of PBKDF2 used. And you can also future-proof your hashes, include the algorithm ID when you store the hash. That way, if algorithm later becomes it's discovered to be insecure, then you can react and, let's say, change to a different algorithm and just store a different algorithm ID in there. There's also something related to hashes called message authentication codes. And they confirm that the data block came from the stated sender and has not been changed. There's a small diagram here. So basically, the hash-based MACs or HMACs are based on crypto hash functions, such as SHA-256 and SHA-3. They generate the hash of the message that you're transmitting with the help of a secret key. And if the key is not known to the attacker, they cannot alter the message, generate a new hash, and come up with the same hash. Because that's the problem when, let's say, you're sending a message and just a plain hash with it. Somebody can modify it in transit, recompute the hash, and store the new hash with it, and just send it on to the destination. With HMAC, it's not possible because the hash is actually generated using a secret key, and that key is not known, so there's no way to generate a corresponding hash. So these types of algorithms probably shouldn't be used everywhere, but only in scenarios where there's a chance that data may be maliciously altered while under attacker's control. So let's say you are storing cookies in the client browser, you are transmitting messages. That's where HMACs will be very useful. And as I mentioned, even encrypted data should be protected by HMAC because there's something called a bit flipping attack, where attacker could play with the bits in the encrypted message, not know what's there, but they could play with it enough so that they, let's say, they could change the amount of the money transfer that's being sent. So let's say you're sending $1,000 to someone, attacker could play with encrypted representation of that to change it to $1 million without actually decrypting the data. So that protects about bit flipping attacks.
In this video, you will learn to describe recommended uses of digital signatures.
There's also something called digital signatures. They ensure that messages and documents come from authentic source. They were not modified in transit. Some recommended uses for that are verifying integrity of data exchanges between nodes, code transmitted over the network for execution, so applets or JavaScript or Android or iOS applications, they're all digitally signed to verify authenticity and integrity. Service packs and fixed packs that a customer installs, so that has to be protected by digital signature to make sure that somebody didn't play with it, didn't put something malicious in a server pack they're applying to the product. Data temporarily saved to the customer machine, for example, backups. And to be useful, they have to be verified. If you create a digital signature but never verify it, it's useless, it's for nothing.
In this video, you will learn to describe how to safeguard encryption keys, describe how to secure the key encryption key.
So, as I mentioned before, safeguarding encryption keys is extremely important. Your solution is only as safe as the safety of your keys. Do not store them in your code, in plain text, in config files, in databases, in plain text. Unfortunately, we see that from time to time. It's just not safe. Proper way to store them is in secure cryptographic storage, something called key stores. Those for you working with Java probably know about Java key stores, but they're corresponding key stores they could be used in other languages. There's also, like, if you're paying attention, there is also a question of how do you secure the cryptographic store, because it has to be secured with a key of its own, something called key encrypting key. Actually, it's kind of a tricky problem, and we see that a lot of products are struggling with that. So how do we secure that key that protects all other keys? And there are a number of recommendations that we have. First of all, there's something called hardware security modules. There's a hardware modules that customer buys, installs in the machine, and they're safely keep track of all encryption keys and digital certificates. You could also use something called virtual HSM. It's a software solution that apparently has similar guarantees as hardware security modules. Another way is to derive key encrypting key from the password that user enters, if that applies to your product. If your product runs standalone, you probably won't be able to do that, but in some products, it's a viable option. So for example, a lot of us have semantic encryption desktop software running on our laptops, and when you log in, when you start your laptop, you enter a password. So that's your key encrypting key. Then the other keys are derived from that, and you can decrypt the contents of the hard drive. There's yet another way of securing key encrypting keys that we recommend. It's to derive it from data that's in some way unique to the machine the product is running on, but that's hard for the attacker to discover. And some of these could be let's say file system metadata, such as random file names, file timestamps, so something that attacker cannot easily steal, because quite often there's a chance to steal a particular file, but to figure out the file that you don't know the name of on the file system, or to figure out the timestamp of that file is much harder. So you could use that information to derive your key encrypted key from.
In this video, you will learn to describe the impacts of quantum computing on cryptography.
Also, I wanted to mention quantum computing. Quantum computing is computing using quantum mechanical phenomena. You may have heard about it. You may have heard that it will negatively affect cryptographic technologies that we use today. Fortunately, we're still about 10, 15 years away from that being practical, but it doesn't hurt to start thinking about it now. And the impact of that is that symmetric encryption will be weakened. So let's say if you're using AES algorithm with 128-bit key, to stay as secure when quantum crypto becomes available, you have to change to 256-bit key. So it shouldn't be too big of a deal. Unfortunately, public key cryptography will be severely affected, will basically be broken. So SSL, TLS, blockchain, digital signatures, all of them will become insecure, and it's worth starting to think about it now and deciding how you would keep your customers protected. There are homomorphic encryptions, I guess, is one way. There's also a class of quantum-resistant algorithms, such as lattice-based cryptography and others. It's something to look into. I think the recommendations for that are not fully fleshed out yet, but to keep your customers secure, it's probably best to start early. One of the problems is that if the shelf life of the data you're protecting is fairly long, an attacker could capture encrypted communications now, and when quantum crypto becomes feasible, decrypt them then. So if that's danger, you probably have to start thinking about it right away. A general good practice in this regard is to make your crypto algorithms quote-unquote replaceable, because as we see, over time things change, some things become insecure, some algorithms become broken. If you have a robust mechanism for replacing your current crypto algorithm for another one in your product, let's say through a fixed pack or a service pack, I think your customers will appreciate it, and you will probably be ahead of your competition. If, let's say, some news break about an algorithm becoming insecure, and you can quickly react to that in your product and replace one algorithm with another without making too many changes, that's a plus. And you can further explore resources related to cryptography.
In this video, you will learn to describe the key takeaways from the module on cryptography.
So to wrap up the key takeaways from this presentation: do encrypt all sensitive data. It doesn't matter whether it's at rest, in use, or in transit. Rely on proven algorithms and use them correctly. It's very easy to make a mistake that renders your cryptographic algorithm insecure. Do not write your own algorithms or rely on your algorithms being hidden. Security by obscurity is no security at all. Use hard-to-guess keys, store them securely. And also follow security news, because from time to time things do come up, algorithms become insecure, and you have to be ready to react if something like that happens in your product.